There is a common misconception, or I would go as far as saying myth, about the advantages of a newer cartridge like this one, where it takes full advantage of its case capacity, that you could get faster velocities than, say, with an older cartridge like this one, where you are restricted, at least in factory ammo, to the SAMI spec, where a bullet's going to be seated down all the way down into there, and you're eking into the powder capacity. The cartridge in front of me, that is a classic that is, well, kind of outdated with its SAMI spec. This is a 7mm Remington Magnum. And the SAMI spec cartridge overall length is 3.290, which is what this is set at, which when you're shooting these heavier, longer bullets, look how much powder capacity you're going into. The theory is you're going to be losing out on velocity because this bullet's seated so deeply, right? That's what I'm going to show is a myth. Now, the new cartridge I'm using as an example is the new 7mm PRC, which was designed to have proper seating depth so that your bullet is not going into the case to hamper case capacity. So at the lowest, your boat tail is just hitting into the shoulder. Back to the 7 mag. Behind this 7 mag is the powder that was basically designed for the 7 mag when it was released in 1962. Back then it was known as IMR 7828. Wasn't really available to the public, but this is the powder that companies were using to put into the 7 mag. And to this day, it is still a fantastic powder for the 7mm Remington Magnum. So why do I say that seating a bullet deep into the powder capacity isn't ruining its potential in velocity? Let's take a deep dive into it. Okay, we're going to use one of my favorite software programs, Gordon's Reloading Tool, also known as GRT. We put in the 7 mag. We did the case volume, the cartridge length. This is where it's important. That's the SAMI spec, 3.290. We're going to use a 26-inch barrel for this, the 175 ELDX, and IMR 7828 SSC. Again, it's a staple for 7 mag. Roughly what you're looking at in a 26-inch barrel while staying under 65,000 psi is basically you're going to get 3,050-ish feet per second, okay, at that length. So, question is, what happens if we seat this bullet out a little further? What happens to the velocity? Okay, so let's say we have a newer rifle and we have the magazine and it's throated correctly so that it could be seated out to that, 3.550 inches. And we're using the same amount of powder. We've now lost almost 100 feet per second. But wait a minute, you can now put more powder in it because you're nowhere close to 65,000 psi. So let's go ahead and put in more powder and see what kind of velocity gain we get because the bullet's seated out further. All right, since the bullet is seated out further, it does decrease the pressure, so we can put more powder in it, and this is the advantage we get. Around 18 feet per second, maybe a little less. Most of us can't even get an ES under 20 feet per second. So, is it a gain? Technically, yes. Is it a sizable advantage gain? No. So in all actuality, when you seat your bullet in further, you are increasing your pressure and you are getting more velocity with what powder you're putting in. So it's actually, in a funny way, a little more efficient. You don't have to burn as much powder to get the velocities you want. So what we're looking at here is if I use that same amount that got me 3,070 feet per second when it's loaded out long, if I loaded it short again with that same amount of powder, now we're quite a bit over pressure and almost 100 feet per second faster. Now there are some disadvantages for seating this bullet so short in this case, especially with these more modern projectiles where they like to be closer to the lands. They maybe don't want to have so much jump. You have a higher potential in accuracy if you're loaded these close to land, so they're not at SAMI spec, especially with, say, like a 175 grain. And that's why, generally speaking, in most guns with factory ammo, you're generally going to have a little bit better accuracy with a 7 PRC than you will with a 7 Rem mag, because it was specifically designed for accuracy. Now, one benefit when you have an older cartridge and you seat the bullet out further is that you could go to a different class of powder. As I said, 7828 is really the powder for 7 mag. But if we seated this bullet, this 175 grain ELDX out further to say like 3.550, we could get into the class of powder of the burn rate around H1000. H1000 burns a bit slower than 7828, and because we are moving this bullet out of the case more, we can fill the case more with H1000, which will in turn give us a full burn. As long as you have a long barrel and a heavy bullet, your accuracy potential will be better because it's a proper burn rate powder. Now, if this is something that you guys are really interested in the proper powders for the proper cartridge and the barrel lengths, I would highly recommend watching Little Crow Gunworks. I've been learning a lot of this from him, and this is where I get the idea of you can move a 7 Rem mag into this type of burning powder rate to a slower burning powder rate, which will in turn will get you faster velocities. Let me show you that on GRT. Now, before I switch to H1000 for the 7 Rem mag that's loaded long, I want to show you the load ratio. Why IMR 7828 SSC might not be ideal when you have your bullet loaded out long. Look at the load ratio. It's basically 93%. I would say you want to be 95, maybe higher. All right, so we are now using H1000. If we get up to 65,000 PSI, we're now basically up to 3,090 feet per second. Now, if you remember when the 7 mag was loaded short, it was topping out with IMR 7828 SSC at 3,050 feet per second. So you're basically almost getting a 40 feet per second bump by loading it long and using H1000. So with H1000, we are getting a 100% burn rate, and well, the load ratio is a little over full. Now let's take a look at the 7 PRC. It was designed very smartly. You are going to get the best in accuracy potential, and it has been designed so that you get your full case capacity potential. So let's see, can the 7 PRC actually be faster than a 7 Rem mag? Because it's not, because the bullet's not eating into the case capacity. Let's find out. All right, so what we're using, these are the case dimensions, case capacity of the 7 PRC. We're going to use a 26-inch barrel because it's a Magnum and it needs a 26-inch barrel. We are also going to be using IMR 7828 SSC. I mean, these cartridges are extremely close in case capacity. You should be using around the same powder. And, okay, the 26-inch barrel using IMR 7828 SSC with 175 ELDX. You're topping out at 3,040-ish feet per second. So just a hair slower than a 7 Rem mag. So if the Rem mag, you remembered, is 3,050 feet per second and 3,070 feet per second when you load the bullets long. So at worst, this cartridge is about 30 feet per second slower. But one thing to note, the 7 PRC cannot go faster than a 7 Rem mag, even when the 7 Rem mag has a SAMI spec case length and the bullet seated down farther. So why do I say IMR 7828 SSC is really good for 7 PRC? Because it has a 95% load ratio and 100% burn rate. What happens when we load it with a slower burning powder? All right, so I put in the data for H1000 to get up close to 65,000 PSI. It does increase our velocity to basically 3,060 feet per second, which is awesome. Look how much we have to put in. Yeah, it's going to be 105% case overload. One last thing about the 7 PRC and having the right barrel length. I know all the rage right now is to go short so that you can put a suppressor on it. And it's not super unwieldy when you have a 26-inch barrel and an 8-inch suppressor. But what happens to your performance, though, when you cut down your barrel? And then the ideal type of powder you're using also affects it. So remember, we're basically at 3,040 feet per second top velocity with IMR 7828 SSC with the 7 PRC. But let's just cut it down to a 24-inch barrel and see the difference. Man, whoa. Now we're at like 2975 feet per second. We've lost a lot of velocity, and we're no longer getting that coveted 3,000 feet per second. But what happens, let's take it down to a 22-inch barrel. There's a lot of 22-inch barrel 7 PRCs. Whoa, you are now down to 2,900 feet per second. Wow, used to be 3,040 feet per second. And 4 inches took it down by 140-ish feet per second. Now with you guys with the shorter barrels, and I'm not trying to pick on the 7 PRC. It could be any Magnum that has a shorter barrel. What's the issue though? Using a slower burning powder like H1000 in a short barrel. I mean, what's the big deal? You've lost, over 100 feet per second. Whoop-de-doo. You still get a 100% burn rate, but that's at max pressure. How many rifles shoot the best at max pressure? I'd say it's kind of rare. Let's take this down to a little bit lower pressure. So we're at 61,000 PSI. And now, because of the 22-inch barrel, you're at 98.4% burnt propellant. And now you are just making it even harder to get the ideal load. Now, what happens when we pick the optimal burn rate for a 7 PRC, especially in a shorter barrel, such as powder like N560, H4831SC is also an excellent choice. We're back to this 22-inch barrel with a 175, but this time I have it loaded with N560. And if you notice at 61,000 PSI, we're at 100% burn rate. And we're right there with the load ratio that we want to be at. Real quick, let's just go to the max load for N560, a 175 ELDX, and a 22-inch barrel. We're at 2,905 feet per second. 96% load ratio, obviously 100% burnt propellant. Do you guys remember the max we could get with H1000? 2920s. So you're losing out on 20 feet per second. I hope there's a couple takeaways from this video. Number one, if you seat a bullet deeper into your case, it's actually going to increase your pressure and your velocity, but you're going to probably not have as accurate if you can't seat these close to the lands. Number two, pick a powder that fits perfectly with your cartridge. You're trying to find the right burn rate so it burns 100% and it has a good, nice case fill that's over 95%. If you are a 7 PRC or a 7 Rem Mag shooter, these 3 powders, that's the ticket, my friends. I understand this is almost impossible to find, but this one and H4831SC, you can't go wrong with them.